keeps prices down far more effectively.
As long as suffering of sentient beings remain, I will remain in order to serve.
I imagined God like my grandfather.
In Conversations today, my guest is one of India's leading artists and perhaps the best-known woman artist. She's done more than 30 solo exhibitions in the capitals of the world, and her works have been under the hammer of Sotheby's and Christie's. I'm delighted to welcome Anjolie Ela Menon. Welcome. When I was sort of researching this, and I'm somewhat familiar with your work and your paintings, there was a newspaper headline that said that, well, I paint to get the devil out of me. Why the devil?
I think you have to have some very strong sources to keep you painting for 42 years. And I don't remember this particular quote, but then one tends to be quoted out of context a great deal. That's one of the hazards of putting your work on public view.
So when you sort of seek to express yourself through painting, what is this? Is this sort of an urge, a catharsis, something waiting to get out?
Well, to a great extent, it dictates itself. And I don't think that the artist ever has full control. And you always sit in front of a canvas waiting for things to happen. In fact, I think when you start taking charge, things do go wrong. You've got to keep that avenue, that path between your subconscious mind and your hand open and let it flow. If I say that I'm waiting for the devil to get out, it's just that my life on the face of it seems to have been incredibly boring, as some newspaper in Calcutta once remarked. And therefore, it's one's inner life, or perhaps one's secret life, that manifests itself on the canvas in spite of oneself, that is of any interest to anyone.
So when you sort of sit in front of this canvas, do you bring sort of an emotion, a feeling, an idea, an image? What do you bring to it, or do you sort of don't prepare for sitting in front of the canvas and just sit there and wait for something to happen?
No, it is that one's whole progress as an artist tends to be linear. I wish it wasn't. I wish one could take quantum jumps where you jump from one whole set of things to another. But unfortunately, what one is painting does have some relation to what one painted last and so on. So if you look at any artist's work, you see a kind of a progression or a regression sometimes from where you started to where you are now. And this does tend to happen. So it isn't that you're painting totally in a void. In fact, one of the major exhibitions that I had recently, about 2 years ago, was called Mutations. And it was really an accumulation of images from all my past work, which I then through a computer morphed. And these same images overlap, but they were my images, and they were just manifesting themselves in a different light. So I think certain images and certain thoughts and processes always stay with an artist. In fact, I wish one sometimes could escape from them, but they're there.
But in this last exhibition where you used computer images and there was a sort of almost photographic reproduction, it seemed, of some of your earlier work, it was obviously you were making conscious choices and selections from your previous work, as opposed to filtering it through your creativity.
So that was the first time, and that whole process was extremely exciting. But even in that, I realized that ultimately I hadn't got away from my own imagery, which is now, it's so much with me, and unfortunately it's also so much in the minds of my viewers, and people who either like or dislike or buy or look at my work. So that's another kind of trap.
And when you begin to use sort of things like, technology like computers, did you find it in some ways sort of obtrusive from the more sort of romantic notion of an artist, with a brush and a palette and working?
Well, many people have, I mean, this has been done a great deal in the West. It's old hat there now, that people have been using both computers and photography and technology in various forms as medium, saying that it's the final image that counts, not the process of how you got to it. But somebody was analyzing this very well the other day and said the difference between computer-made images and images where or a painting where the hand is still used is a kind of aura. It's something that you can't explain. But those paintings which have been completely made by hand have an aura which the machine-produced images don't have.
What is it? What did it do for you? The sort of the process of creating something that was using computers and technology. Did it do something to your sense of control?
No, I think it was very, very exciting because, as I said, one of the things that one longs for is a release. When they talk about the artist struggle, for instance, what is the artist struggle? I think many people mistake this artist struggle to be the struggle in the garret and the struggle with poverty and struggle with not having enough money and so on. That's just part of it, the hardship, the physical hardship. But the real struggle is, and I think I've experienced this about 10 or 15 times in my life as an artist, is that when you're making the transition from one phase to the other, and if you don't go on making this transition, then you get stuck in a rut.
Sure.
And your work becomes static, and you don't feel that really that there's any point in going on. And that struggle, you sometimes just, it's like the myth of Sisyphus. You can be climbing this mountain, you get to the top and you just roll down again, and you don't see the other side at all. So these sort of digressions, I did that one exhibition with painted objects, and that was a delightful digression. It wasn't that I was going to now forever do only painted objects, but it was very frivolous. It was very different from my earlier work, which had been almost damned as being half in love with death. It was it was sort of mischievous, frivolous work, and that was a very welcome digression.
Much of it, if I sort of recall, focused on figures in human forms, and was sort of reflecting complex internal processes in those forms. When you look at a painting you've just completed, when do you feel complete? When do you sort of put it away?
Well, you don't at the time. When a painting has just been done, you're much too close to it. And even technically, it takes a long time. I really like to turn a painting to the wall and come back to it after a month or two. And then you see its flaws, you see its technical flaws. You tend to do one other thing which is not very good, and that is to cover up. I tend to cover up, and I've been accused of that.
What do you mean cover up?
Well, say in the earlier work, it was just very spontaneous, and the paint came off the palette, sometimes straight out of the tube.
Right.
It was more spontaneous. It was more raw passion. Whereas in the later work, which became almost too careful, there was this tendency to always mask, to put yet another layer of somber color, so that the paintings were, the face of the image just glowed out of the dark. So that perhaps is a bad tendency, but it does go somewhat to completing a painting rather than leaving it unfinished.
Is there a sort of a climactic moment when sort of you feel that you reached the peak of expression in creating that painting, and then there's sort of the falling off when you're finishing it?
Yeah,
when it sort of falls into place.
Well, some paintings. I don't think all paintings are created with this kind of passion, but certainly some of the paintings that one has done were created because one was moved by something, or one's own emotional state at the time led to these kind of outpourings.
Your work has also been described as sort of sort of based on sort of modern images, but with a Renaissance light to them.
Yes.
What kind of influences do you feel are you aware of, apart from the unconscious influences that have acted on
as
you?
far as technique was concerned, the influence was very conscious. It was just that I was in Paris during the early 60s, and as a young rebel, I rebelled against the modernism, which was all-pervading at the time, and sort of plunged back into time. In fact, I was much more influenced. It isn't really Renaissance. I think critics have mistakenly talked about it having a Renaissance hue. It was more Romanesque, which was pre-Renaissance, because I was very taken with the kind of formal, full frontal quality of early Romanesque art and its complete strength. Whereas later European art, to me at the time, seemed to be much more effete, over-ornamented, and too beautiful. Whereas Romanesque art had a kind of stark strength to it, which I really took to at the time when I was 17, 18 years old. But the influence, even though my subject matter had changed, later on people said that a lot of things that I did were very related to the pre-Raphaelites, which seemed to be out of context to someone who's painting in the 20th century. I've always been accused of being out of context. I think I still am.
How often do you feel that critics and viewers pick up sort of many of the nuances of your intention in painting, both in terms of style and the content of the painting?
Well, some I think understand one, and some don't. I don't think you have that choice, though. I think the minute you, as I say, go public, you have to take the critics that you like with the critics that you dislike or disagree with. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. It's only one's work that matters, and one's own approach to how one is working at the time.
So what role do you think art criticism in fact has, apart from sort of judging a painting and saying, well, this is good and worth viewing, and so it's now going to be worth more money?
Oh, let's not talk about this money. I think this whole terrible bogey of money has invaded the art world, and we are going through, I think, our worst phase in the history of Indian art because of this money factor.
In what ways? Why is money factor sort of not a good thing? You have this image of struggling artists, and now you feel that there are more people willing to pay money for art.
Well, that's all very well. I'm very glad that artists are finally able to make a living. But I don't think that art should be judged in those terms. And I think that there were certain writers and journalists who, I shan't name them, who at one time did a great deal of harm by starting this whole business of the best 20 and the best. It's not a 100 meters race where you have 1, 2, and first, second, and third. And this first, second, and third, I'm afraid, is only being judged in money terms, which is very sad.
What do you think has sort of has brought this about? Do you think it's just the changing nature of our lives, where we're driven by
Absolutely,
consumerism
it's part of the same thing. It's really part of the same thing. And it's also part of which is a good thing, of an expanding market, of therefore more people who are unwilling to really look at the art, who are willing to look at it now because it has some value.
When did you when did painting begin for you?
Oh, I was 12, I think. I was in Lawrence School, Lovedale, where they had a wonderful art department. It was a very military school, and the only oasis in this tremendous militarism, which was a shock to me as a young kid to suddenly be thrust into this left-right, was this art department where you went, and it was very quiet. There was always lovely music playing, and this teacher, Sushil Mukherjee, who was quite a genius at teaching, and he died recently in America, and I was extremely sad. He was teaching to the bitter end in colleges in America, but he was willing to let us, go as far as we could. It wasn't that you are only 12, so you can only paint in watercolors.
Right.
But let us paint in oils if you wanted to.
In some of the other art forms like music, there is this great emphasis on the sadhana, on sort of the training before you become a musician or before you go out and perform before the public. What kind of sadhana does a painter go through?
Well, a painter must. I think that a lot of people now think that they needn't. There are lots of painters who are just all raring to go, where they barely come out of art school. I think the sadhana continues throughout your life as a painter. I think it's very important to do one's daily riyaz, which I try to do even if I'm traveling.
So what is a daily riyaz for a painter?
Daily riyaz for painters, to sit there, open your box of paints, start to work a little, if not to draw, if not just to think, think about your work in isolation, not just in passing, not while you're cooking lunch. Give it time, very serious time. That's what kept me going. Because I have worn two hats of being a housewife, of being a naval officer's wife, so we had to travel, change house 30 times.
Yes, 32 was the figure that was mentioned.
Yes, well, I've lost count now. Hopefully I've settled once and for all now. But it was only possible because one had that, the discipline of one's work had to take priority over everything else.
So do you sometimes just practice because you want to refine your skills and then throw it away?
Oh yes. For instance, you can spend a whole month just playing with Prussian blue, seeing what its properties are. There are so many pigments, and I think I only am beginning to understand about 4 of them so far. I probably understand brown quite well, and blue perhaps.
But you know, when you reached a stage where you know, you're a celebrity painter, and what you produce sells, isn't the temptation enormous to sort of put out into the world whatever you create?
Well, I try. Partly, I have to admit that partly I don't produce as much as the so-called market wants because I'm bone lazy, and I don't paint as much as I could. I still need that sort of sword of Damocles of an impending exhibition to make me work. Otherwise, I just goof off.
Well, it's been 2 years, about 2 years since you had your sort of last series of exhibitions.
No, I had the show last December.
Okay.
So, but I've been goofing off ever since because I cancelled my London show this year.
Why was that?
Well, there was some problem with the gallery. So I'm just having a great time, enjoying my grandmotherhood. So I said, this is going to be the year of the grandmother.
So what sort of, do you plan ahead towards a show then, or is it when you...
No, you don't really plan ahead for a show, but then if you have, like last time, I had Jahangir Gallery, the main hall, looming over me, and that needed 50 or 40 paintings to even fill it. So, I mean, till quite late, I thought of cancelling the show, and then I said, you can't chicken out, you've got to accept this challenge. So, in short, I painted like hell for 3 or 4 months. Really produced a very huge body of work. So that's a good thing in a way. I always tell young artists that you really want to get ahead, go book a gallery, and then you'll see how the work comes pouring out.
So it isn't, again, always sort of the romantic idea of an artist sort of wishing to express his soul, but sort of external pressures of needing to fill a gallery can make a difference.
It can make a difference. You're still expressing your soul, but here you're having to do it.
You know, what is sort of most important for you in the paintings that you create? You know, the appreciation of, I don't know, your husband, your family, the art critics, the reviewer, the people who pay for paintings.
Well, as far as husband and family are concerned, I said in a very recent interview into a newspaper, they hardly can tell the difference between a great painting and a great souffle. So they take it so much for granted. They hardly react. They may react when they see it on the wall of a gallery. But while I'm doing it, I mean, they're tremendously irreverent. Children walk all over the paintings. I paint on the floor. And I've had, in the past, a huge mural which I was doing for the Indira Gandhi airport. I came back one evening, it was all spread on the floor, the panels. And there were these great pug marks of Reebok, where my son had taken his friends on a conducted tour, and they just walked all over the wet paintings. So it's not the family so much. And certain critics, yes, I do value their judgment very much. My friend Manjula Padmanabhan has been a critic of my work for many years. I value her judgment a great deal. And
then sort of the 32 years that you traveled in different geographical landscapes and environments, have you felt a correlation when you look back between the impact of those environments and your work?
Oh yes, but I think in my work it's more the people that I'm with that seem to affect my paintings. It's more the events in my life rather than geographical places. or certain influences at a particular time, which again seem to have very little relation to geography.
You mentioned that...
So we spent years in Russia, but and people feel that a lot of the influence in my work were Russian, but they don't realize that the Russian influence in my work far preceded our sojourn in Russia. It was already there.
What about the windows?
Yes, the
Framing
windows.
of... how did that happen?
Well, a lot of things that happen in art, as I said to a friend the other day, we were at an art camp, happen by a series of what I call happy accidents. Many, certainly technical things happen. You spill something and it creates a wonderful effect, or you mix two colors and it creates a great effect, or you spill, you step on a painting and you see that there's the shoe mark, which is interesting, which may lead to a whole series of shoe marks, and so on. But the window was, I was already painting windows at that time as an image, as a metaphor of this whole question of looking out and looking in. I'd already done a series of windows. And then there was a sudden call for a painting for a certain exhibition, and this painting was there and there was no frame. So I was really frantic. My husband wasn't there, there was no transport, so I rushed down to the garage and there was an old window lying there. So I fitted this painting into the old window, and we hammered and banged, and it sort of fitted. I had to cut the sides a bit. Fortunately, I paint on board, so it was easy. And there the first window painting was born. And at the time I was buying old doors and windows for a house that we were building in Bangalore. This is about 20 years ago. And that one window painting was so successful, it seemed to have fitted in with the theme that I was painting at the time. And a whole series of such paintings followed.
In recent years, in recent months, weeks, you've really been involved with sort of the protests against censorship and control and regulating what painters can do. What prompted you? Have you ever felt constrained about your painting?
No, I haven't. But I really consider Hussein as one of my mentors and gurus, and I was extremely angry and disturbed at the attacks against him. So it all started with that. But then, I think for the first time in one's life, one sat back and realized that one of the reasons why Indian art has progressed to the extent it has, and why we are finding our place in this whole global scene, is because we and journalists and writers and all creative people in this country have really enjoyed extraordinary freedom. And it is this freedom which has led to this great flourishing of the arts. Even when other things in this country have not flourished, I think the arts have flourished. Music and dance and theatre, everything has flourished in this country. Writing particularly has had extraordinary freedom. I think we were really one of the freest countries in the world. So this looming spectre of censorship, but it frightened us considerably. A lot of us have become very frightened of the fact that there may be a situation where we are going to be told what we can paint and what we can't. And I think that this kind of censorship will put us back a great deal. So we all have been fighting about it. It's not just me.
Were you sort of disappointed that Mr. Hussain then climbed down and apologized?
Well, I'm not sure what his motives in doing so were, because one of the things that I kept saying in his defense was that I don't think it was ever his intention to hurt anyone's sentiments. These paintings were really painted 25 years ago. A lot of people have now, there's a dreadful pamphlet that's going around trying to condemn him and to prove that he in fact hated Hindu gods and goddesses, which is ridiculous. And I argued that he painted over 250 paintings on the Ramayana and nearly that much on the Mahabharata. And did he do this out of hate? I mean, it doesn't seem to be very plausible. So I was rather surprised that he did apologize, because that's almost admitting that...
admitting guilt in some ways.
Guilt in some way, which I don't think he was ever guilty of this at all. There was certainly no intention to hurt.
You sort of, in some ways, in your personality, or at least the apparent personality, contradict the image of the eccentric artist. Are you eccentric?
Well, some people think I am.
In what ways?
In some ways. I think unpredictability is the hallmark of the eccentric. And I tend to becoming more eccentric as I grow older. But having chosen the path of marriage, I think I had to force myself to conform. I think I was much more eccentric at the age of 20, when I was only answerable to myself. But having to live within the framework of not only marriage, but marriage into the Navy, which was so structured.
Right.
One had to learn to behave. But then the actual secret is that one lived on two planes completely. And I was well on my way to becoming completely schizophrenic, I think. Trying to really live two lives, wear two hats simultaneously. That's becoming harder and harder now. I think those two personalities begin to meld somewhere, making it easier.
So, do you think it might happen? There might be sort of this sort of grand eruption of eccentricity.
I've often threatened to break out, but then it's always, I think, one's children mainly that have brought one back to reality. In fact, now I think that my husband, having left the Navy, is far more eccentric than I am.
But do you have this sort of fantasy about something that you might just sort of step out and do?
Yes, I have a fantasy of being like Hussein, whose tremendous mobility I always admire tremendously. He met me the other day and he said, come on, let's go to Ahmedabad to see my gufa, which you haven't seen. So I said, like when? He said, now, chalo, chalte hain airport ko. And I said, wow, you know, this is what I've always longed to do. That he'd just hop on a plane and go off to New York at the drop of a hat. That is my idea of that kind of mobility.
So that's a warning to the family.
Well, I've started doing it, I think. I'm just going to go off to Murano.
So as an artist now, and with some 40 odd years of painting behind you, what aspiration do you have for yourself?
Well, I think the main thing is that to just have the time and ability to keep painting. You don't want your faculties to start backing up. You know, one's eyes get weaker, and painting, especially large pictures, can be physically quite taxing. I just want some time. I want 10 years of good painting time. And that's what I really want.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.